I'm just going to let y'all know I'm really nervous. This is the first time that I had actually shared my testimony, aside from writing in a book, but writing it is a lot different than speaking about it. But the Lord brought me here, and He's going to bring me through, and it will be fine. So just for, the purpose of time, I'm just going to hit the highlights of what I've been through, but I go into a whole lot more detail about my story and kind of what I've been through in my book, so that is an option. You can get it on Amazon, or I have a few at that back table. But before I kind of go over my story, I wanted to share a Bible verse with you guys. And when I first read this verse, I just felt like it truly encompassed my entire story. It is Jeremiah 29:10, and it says, "This is what the Lord says, you will be in Babylon for 70 years, but then I will come and do for you all of the good things I have promised, and I will bring you home again." And, okay, if you don't know much about Babylon and the Babylonians, they came and took the Israelites captive for a very long time. And when I read this verse, it just resonated with me because I just felt like that was me. I was in captivity to my hurts and my traumas, my past and my sin. But through my darkest trial, the Lord came and He did for me all the good things He promised. And through that darkest trial, He brought me home again. And my hope and my prayer is that my testimony and my story can help you realize that He can do the same for you if you allow Him to do that. So I was actually born in Ohio. I come from a really long line of pastors, missionaries, church planters. When they say born and raised in church, that was me. At the church that I was kind of born into, my parents were pastors there. And that church just held a really special place in my heart. It's where I first saw Jesus at work. It's where I first saw people lifting hands in worship. It's where I first saw people speaking in tongues. It's where I first took communion. It's where I first came to know Jesus. And everybody there was just one big happy family. And I had very much placed a lot of hope and dreams in that church. I just knew that after my parents retired, like me and my siblings and our kids and our families would take over and we would run the ministry. And then when we retired, our kids would do it. And it would just be like this long generational thing. And I just knew that I was going to grow old and gray in this church. And it really was where I was the happiest. I absolutely loved that church and the people in that church. So when I was around 10, I was pretty devastated to find out that we were going to be going to another local church. And I definitely made that known. I was very vocal about the fact that I was upset about it. But we did get plugged into this church, and it was another, big happy family. We spent a lot of time there, and it was really just a blessing. And then around the time that I turned 12, my dad took a job as a children's pastor in Florida, and we moved here in the middle of my 6th grade year. And as a 12-year-old, moving was not on my to-do list. And again, I was very vocal about that fact. My parents will attest to that. And so we moved in the middle of my 6th grade year, and I found myself kind of as the odd one out at school, because if you come in the middle of the year, people know. And to top it off, we had gone to a Christian school up until that point. So going to public school was a culture shock, and I think that everybody could tell that I was just different. And so on top of already very angry about the previous transitions that we had, I found myself feeling very lonely. And I didn't really know how to deal with that loneliness. And then about 13, I think, when my parents told us that they were getting a divorce. And I felt like somebody had pulled the rug out from under me. I mean, my whole world just was upside down. And I really just felt like our move and everything that I had just been through was in vain. I felt like it was for nothing. Like I had just gone through all of these transitions for nothing. What do I have to show for it? And I felt like the Lord had brought my family to Florida just to tear my family apart. And so in my mind, I felt like we were supposed to be blessed, we were supposed to be together, and it felt like God had turned his back on a family who had dedicated their lives to serving him. And it was in those moments that I just really wondered where God was in my brokenness, and I wondered where he was in my hurt, and I truly started to believe that he had abandoned me. And so with all of those negative feelings, I started to be very angry with God, just about everything that had happened to me. And so I decided to make it my life's mission to hurt God in the way that I felt like he had hurt me. And so I started going down just a very dark path, and I started hanging out with people that I should not have been hanging out with. And I paid a pretty high price for those choices. I found myself in an abusive relationship at the age of 14, and I stayed pretty silent throughout its entirety. I really didn't tell anybody. I don't think I knew how to tell people either. I mean, I was 14 at the time. What do you say about that? But by the grace of God, I was able to detach myself from my abuser, and it was shortly before I turned 18. And if it wasn't for a really good friend finding out and intervening, I don't think I would be here telling you guys this story. And unfortunately, the abuse was so traumatic and impactful that I'm still kind of healing from its effects, like more than 10 years after it has ended. But God brings beauty from ashes, even though I would not see that for quite some time. So I ended up meeting my husband the summer that I turned 18. And our story is really funny, and I love to tell it. But because time, I am not going to. So if you buy my book at all, buy it for that reason, because our story, it is literally my favorite thing to tell. But we dated for about 2 years before we found out we were pregnant with our oldest. And honestly, we were not ready to be parents. But he was born 2 months early, so he spent that entire 2 months in the NICU. He had a lot of health issues, and he was actually initially given a 50-50 survival rate. But God worked miracles, and he was very faithful to us, and we now have a thriving 9-year-old. But it was a pretty traumatic experience. I was only 20 when I had him. But unfortunately, God's faithfulness during that time just was not enough to convince me to trust him. And so I stayed very angry at him, and our relationship stayed very fragmented. And then 2 years after that, we got pregnant with our middle child. And he was actually supposed to be much earlier than our oldest. There was just a few health issues that kind of came into play with that. But again, God was very faithful, and he worked his miracles, and he was full term and completely healthy. But again, I still just couldn't be convinced to trust the Lord, and I still stayed angry, and I just really did not want to have anything to do with him. And then 2 years after that, we found out we were pregnant with our third baby. But unfortunately, that happiness was very quickly replaced with grief. At 12 weeks, we were told that we had lost the baby. And that next morning, or afternoon, I don't know, the next day, I remember sitting on my shower floor. I just felt completely hopeless and alone and devastated. And I was trying really hard not to feel anything because I had taught myself very early on that if I don't feel things, then I don't have to talk about them, I don't have to relive them, I don't have to deal with them. They can just cease to exist. And so in that moment, I was really trying my hardest to not grieve, because I knew that if I started the grieving process, everything that I had been through was going to come to the surface, and I did not want to deal with it. But it was in my most broken moment that the Lord came to me, and he came to me audibly, and he said, you can keep letting the enemy take things from you, or you can get up and fight, but you need to make a choice right now. And for my entire life, up until that point, I had blamed God for everything bad that had happened to me. But what I failed to realize is that it wasn't God who was to blame, it was the enemy. And he had wreaked havoc on my life, just creating chaos. And he had come into my life and he had come to kill, steal, and destroy. But in this moment of brokenness, and in this moment that the enemy thought that I would be too weak to fight back, something very suddenly shifted in my spirit, and I just felt this urgency to take back what was rightfully mine, and I wanted to take back everything that the enemy had stolen from me. And I found that it's in our moments of weakness and in our moments of brokenness and hurt that the enemy expects to come and wreak havoc on our lives, because he knows that it's much easier to steal, kill, and destroy when somebody already feels too weak to fight back. And at some point, I had stopped fighting the enemy as he came and he took things that never belonged to him in the first place. And since I was a little girl, he had come into my life and taken what he wanted. He took my family, he took my happiness, he took my emotional state, he took my faith, and he nearly took my marriage. And from a young age, Satan told me that broken people don't get happiness. He assured me that if God truly loved me, he wouldn't have allowed all of these bad things to happen to me. He lied and said that my insecurities were very much warranted and that I was never going to be good enough, pretty enough, or perfect enough. And he convinced me that people who come from broken families don't get wholesome marriages. And as he was taking all of these things from me, he was just destroying everything in my life. And he thought that if he could do it again, I would be too weak to fight back, and he would still be able to pull me farther from the Lord, just like he had done for my entire life. But then he made the biggest mistake when he took my child. And in that moment of brokenness, and in that moment of weakness that the enemy thought he could use against me, I decided that I was not going to allow him to use the loss of my child to further pull me from the Lord. And I decided in that moment of brokenness that this loss would not be in vain. And so in that moment, I began the fight of my life, and I just started seeking after the Lord just wholeheartedly and with every fiber of my being. And shortly after my loss, the Lord came to me again and said that he was going to give me words of wisdom, and from those words, I would be able to heal, and I was to write a book. And so I'm going to focus on probably the biggest lesson that I learned during this whole process. So my book is called Bandaids and Bleeding Wounds. So naturally I was doing research on wounds and how they heal and things like that. And we kind of already know that physical wounds need proper care in order to heal correctly. And if you don't help it heal kind of immediately, you run the risk of your wound becoming chronic or infected, and then that causes the healing process to become much harder and typically much more painful. So if you could have a wound where if you just clean it with soap and water and be on your merry way, it would be fine. But instead, you don't heal it, or you don't start the healing process immediately, and then it becomes infected, and now you have to amputate your whole arm just because you didn't stop and take the time to heal it. And now the healing process has become that much harder and that much more painful. And I found that our emotional wounds are pretty much the same. If we don't begin the healing process immediately, as soon as we feel hurt, we run the risk of our wounds becoming infected and causing the healing process to become that much more difficult and that much more painful. And I want you guys to just take a moment and envision the circumstance from just where your pain stems, especially the circumstances that you want to forget about, that you would so much rather ignore and act like they never exist, those places that you just don't want to remember, whether that's the loss of a child or an addiction, a sickness, the ending of a friendship, or even a parent abandoning you when you were a kid. I had spent a great deal of time sealing off those parts of me from myself, from the world, from God. And I thought that if nobody knew they existed, then I would never have to revisit them. I would never have to talk about them. I could go on acting like they did not exist. And that was the way that I dealt with all of my hurts. But it took the loss of my baby for me to realize that by hiding my pain, I was only causing more of it. And I was merely placing a Band-Aid over a deep bleeding wound, except the Band-Aid never stopped the bleeding, and in turn the wound became infected. I thought that by ignoring my pain, it would cease to exist and I could go on happy and carefree. And I somehow believed that it would heal itself. In our human nature, we have come to believe that healing is synonymous with numbness and detachment, but that's not healing. Healing happens when you are able to thrive and minister despite the pain and despite the past. It happens when you are no longer in shackles, when you are no longer in captivity to your pain, your trauma, your past, your hurts, your heartache, and your brokenness. But the only way that you are able to receive healing is to admit that you need it. And when I finally started the grieving process, I felt like I had been hit by a semi. And I remember being so desperate for healing at that point. And the pain of my current loss was just so unbelievably unbearable. And on top of that, I hadn't dealt with all of my past hurts and brokenness and all of those things. And I realized that every hurt that I had gone through at that point, I had slapped a Band-Aid over, and it had finally caught up to me, and I was now bleeding profusely from all of my wounds, and I didn't know how to make it stop. I mean, everything was just coming to the surface, and I could not hold myself together. And I was completely devastated, and again, I just did not know how to get myself out of the mess I was now in. And I very vividly remember driving in my car one afternoon, and in all of my anger and in all of my brokenness and pain, I just cried out to the Lord, and I said, why can't I be healed already? When is this going to stop? Please heal me. Like, I'm done feeling this way. And his answer was very simple, and he said, not right now. And I did not like that answer at all one bit. And again, in all of my anger and brokenness and my bitterness, I said, why? Why not right now? Because I have suffered long enough. When are you going to make it stop? I don't want to carry this burden anymore. And he very gently said, your healing won't come this side of heaven. Your healing will come when you are with me in paradise. But do not think that I have forsaken you or that I will forget about your pain. The pain you feel will always be there, but one day it will not be as raw. One day you will use the pain to minister to those that are like you. One day your pain will become a blessing, for I bring beauty from ashes and from pain. I didn't like that answer either. It really was not what I wanted to hear. And oftentimes I found that he doesn't answer us in the way that we would like. But there was such a peace that fell over me me because I knew that everything that I had been through was not going to be in vain. He was going to use it to touch other people. And he was going to use my testimony or my trial as a testimony to heal other people. And that was enough for me. That got me through the day. But this interaction with the Lord it reminded me of this woman in the Bible. She had a bleeding problem, and she could not find a doctor to heal her, and she spent a good 12 years searching for healing, and she came up empty-handed every time. And at this point in the Bible, news had spread like wildfire about Jesus, because the Jews had waited generations for the Messiah to finally come and to free them from the Roman Empire. And so thousands of people would gather to hear him preach. They wanted to see him cast out demons and work miracles, and they just really wanted to be able to say that they got to see the Messiah in action. Like, how cool is that? But when we meet this woman, Jesus is on his way to do a very specific miracle. And when I read this story, I often picture the crowd being massive. Again, there's thousands of people. And I picture the disciples kind of like 6 going in front of him, 6 going behind him, kind of like modern day bodyguards. And I mean, people would have been just reaching out, trying to touch him. They would have been yelling his name, yelling at him to do certain things. It would have just been utter chaos. But it's in this moment that's born out of chaos, and that's born out of suffering, and that's born out of faith, that we get to see a miraculous healing. And this woman's story is found in Mark 5:27-34. So she had heard about Jesus, and she came up behind him through the crowd and touched his robe. For she thought to herself, if I could just touch his robe, I will be healed. And immediately the bleeding stopped, and she could feel in her body that she had been healed of her terrible condition. Jesus realized at once that healing power had gone out of him, and so he turned around in the crowd and asked, who touched my robe? And his disciples said to him, look at this crowd pressing around you. How can you ask who touched me? But he kept on looking around to see who had done it. Then the frightened woman, trembling at the realization of what had happened to her, fell to her knees in front of him, told him what she had done, and then he said to her, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace. Your suffering is over. And like me, this woman was so desperate to find the healing. She had spent all of her money on doctors to find a cure, and again, only to come up empty-handed every time. And she could have easily given up, and she could have easily accepted that she was going to have this condition for her whole life, and to accept that she would never find healing. But yet she seeks out a man who could very well be a fraud. And that's because she knew that if Jesus was who he said he was, he would be the healing that she had been searching for most of her life. And here's this woman trying to shout for her healer, calling his name only to be met with the buzzing of the crowd. She tries to push her way through the crowd of hundreds, if not thousands of people, only to be shoved to the ground because she's too weak to push through. She's so desperate that she crawls on her hands and knees in the dirt and mud, getting kicked and stepped on in the process, just to touch his robe. Not to talk to him, not to have Jesus lay hands on her or pray this long, exuberant prayer. She desperately just wanted to touch his robe, for her fingertips to graze the fabric that enclosed the healer. Because she knew where her healing came from, and in her desperation to find healing, her faith made her well. And Jesus stops, and even with the loudness of the crowd, he knew that she was the one who sought him out to be healed. Even with the thousands of people touching him, he knew that she was the one who had faith enough to just touch his robe. And the Lord wants us to be so desperate for him. He wants us to be so desperate that we will do whatever it takes just to touch his robe. He wants us to be so desperate that we will come to him bleeding and broken. He wants us to be so desperate that we don't care about the rest of the crowd. We only care to get down in our hands and knees in the dirt and mud of our struggles and in our pain, and to know that only He is the healer. And through my loss, I had become so desperate in my search for healing that I found myself laying at His feet, bleeding and broken. And so I just immersed myself in Jesus and just started to desperately seek Him with every fiber of my being. And I started to become just completely and wholeheartedly honest with Him about my hurts and my traumas and even the anger that I had towards Him for all those years. And like He did with this woman, He came to me and He healed me. And because I was desperate enough to lay my hurts at His feet and to get down on my hands and knees in the dirt and mud of my struggles and my trauma and my hurts, He healed me. And after years of desperately searching for healing, I had finally found it. And I had found it through the healer. But to get to that place of healing, we must first step out in faith, admit we need help, and desperately seek Him. Now, religion teaches us that we shouldn't do this. And let me go ahead and tell you that that is a lie straight from the pits of hell if I ever did hear one. Because God wants us to desperately seek Him despite our pain, despite our past, despite our brokenness. He doesn't care that we come with all of this trauma and all of this baggage, just as long as we come to Him, just as long as we're seeking Him, just as long as we are there to just touch His robe. And I really pray that my story can encourage you to do that. And I pray that you guys would just begin to lay your baggage at His feet. And if you will allow Him, I promise that He will use your trials, your circumstances, your pain to do for you all the good things that He has promised. And I promise that if you allow Him, He will use your pain, your circumstance, your trauma, your baggage to bring you home again. I would absolutely love to connect with all of you. I would love to hear your stories and everything that the Lord has done for you. And so I'll be at the back table for a few minutes after if you want to stop by. Like I said, I go into a whole lot more detail than what I talked about in my book. But you guys can also find me on social media. We can connect that way if you want to talk or just share your story. But I am really thankful that y'all brought me here and that I was able to share my story. And I really pray that it just really resonates with you and speaks to you and encourages you.